Hey everyone, in today's video I am going to give you a full review of the L.M. Montgomery Anne of Green Gables series. This will feature all 9 official books in the series. I will give you the plot of each book as well as highlight things that I liked about the book but also really disliked about the book. Just a heads up, in next Saturday's video I will be talking about all of the spin-offs of the Anne of Green Gables series written by L.M. Montgomery and also by other authors. So sit back and grab a snack because this is going to be a very long video. Anne of Green Gables. I'm pretty sure most of us know the plot, but this follows an orphaned red-headed girl who's very imaginative and very spunky. She ends up getting adopted by the Cuthberts, who instead wanted a boy and not a girl. Eventually they end up keeping her, and then we get to see the many adventures of Anne. We also get introduced to characters Diana Barry and Gilbert Blythe. So first I want to talk about the characters in this book. Obviously we have Anne Shirley, our main character. Anne is a very imaginative girl. She's very talkative, she's very spunky, and just a wonderful children's character and probably one of the most iconic literary characters of all time, especially in Canadian literature. We also have Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, the old spinster and bachelor siblings who take in Anne. We also have the busybody Rachel Lynn, who is Marilla's neighbor and one of her best friends. We also have Diana Barry, who is Anne's bosom friend, and Gilbert Blythe, who ends up being Anne's arch enemy in this novel, but as we further go on, you will see that relationship definitely change. There are quite a few other side characters in this book, but those are really the main ones that you need to know about. I have to admit that my memory of this book is kind of fuzzy, as I did read it in like May of last year. If my memory serves me right, I really can't find a single fault with this book. This is a book that just makes me feel so many things. First of all, I love Anne and all these scrapes that she gets into and how she looks at things. It's just wonderful. But I love the setting of Avonlea. It's like when I read about Avonlea and Anne of Green Gables, I get that fuzzy, warm feeling in my chest and in my stomach, and it makes me feel like I'm home. Like, it just gives you that nostalgic, comforting feeling, and I absolutely love this. This is easily one of my favorite books I've ever read. The one thing that I will say about this book is that L.M. Montgomery's writing is very flowery, very expressive, and it's just so elegant and beautiful, and I think that we need more of this writing in modern times. I feel like back then, they had such more expressive words for things and used such expressive language. Nowadays, it's like we lost that, and it's only the rare books you come across that really have that expressive writing. So that's what I really love about the Anne of Green Gables series. It's just the writing is so gorgeous and beautiful, and the little stories that happen in this book and in this series. Another thing that I will say is that all of the, book to movie adaptations that I've seen of Anne of Green Gables just don't come close to the original book. I've seen the 80s adaptation of this book by Kevin Sullivan. Those are probably my favorite adaptations because I grew up with them, but honestly, they're so far from the book that is not an accurate representation of what the book is actually like. And then you have the more recent one with the CBC series Anne with an E. I watched an episode of that, and honestly I couldn't watch any further because I didn't like it. It wasn't very similar to the book. I think that you're not going to find a true representation of this book in any of the movies that have been made, which is really sad because I would love to have an accurate representation of this book in a movie or a TV series and have it follow all of the books. That would be like amazing, but it's probably not going to happen. So this book was definitely a 5-star read for me. We have Anne of Avonlea. The second book follows Anne while she is teaching at the Avonlea school, while she's also studying to further her education. In this book, Anne and Gilbert have finally reconciled their differences. They are on speaking terms now and are quite friendly to one another. In this book, we also see Anne and Marilla take in twins Davy and Dora. Dora is very quiet and demure, while Davy is very loud, outspoken, and very rambunctious. They come to live with Marilla and Anne because their mother has died, and then subsequently their uncle ends up dying. But now that their uncle has died, they end up staying with Anne and Marilla permanently. We also have a few new characters in this book being introduced. We have Mr. Harrison and his potty mouth parrot. Anne also has a pupil from the Avonlea school. We have young Paul Irving, who is an American boy who comes to live with his grandmother in Avonlea. Paul is like Anne in many ways. He is very smart, very bright, but also very imaginative. Later on in the book, we meet Miss Lavender Lewis, who is an old spinster who was basically, I guess, in a quarrel with her lover, and they never married. We later learn that Miss Lavender lover was actually Paul Irving's father. And of course, Anne, with her matchmaking ways, she ends up getting the two together, and by the end of the book, they end up marrying. Also, at the end of the book, Rachel Lynde's husband ends up dying, so she ends up staying with Marilla. And thus, now that Marilla has someone with her all the time, Anne can continue her studies. So this book is just as good as the first. You have just the classic Avonlea stories and all the, the mischief that goes on. Anne gets herself in quite a few scrapes even now that she's a little bit older. But we also get to see her friendship with Gilbert grow, which is just so heartwarming and what we all wanted. But we also have the wonderful addition of the new characters, and we really get to see Anne and how she deals with certain disagreements with other Avonlea folks, and also the friendship that she makes with some others. I do really love the characters in this book. I especially love Paul Irving, Anne's little pupil. He's just so much like Anne, and it's so cute. I love his little fairy world that he escapes to. It's really sweet. And then we have Mr. Harrison, who is super grumpy and super opinionated, but all around is pretty hilarious. And Davy and Dora. We don't see much of Dora in this book. She's merely mentioned. She doesn't really talk a lot. It's mostly Davy that is the focus of the twins because he is the more troublesome one, and some of the stuff he says about religion and God and marriage is just shocking for a little fella of this time. It's pretty hilarious. So this is just such an enjoyable book, and it's like the classic core of Anne of Green Gables, so it's just a wonderful book. This was a 5-star read for me. Next, we have Anne of the Island. In this third book, Anne leaves Green Gables to pursue her education at Redmond College in Nova Scotia. Gilbert Blythe and Charlie Sloane also enroll, as well as Anne's friend Priscilla Grant, whom she met at Queen's Academy. Anne also meets Philippa Gordon, also known as Phil, throughout the novel. Phil is a beautiful girl, and Anne is automatically drawn to her, thinking that they will become bosom friends, which they do. And Priscilla and Phil all rent out a room at a boarding house for their first year. In their second year, they end up acquiring a house that they completely dream about boarding to. Just as it happens, one of the characters that do come in a novel is the niece of one of the women that own the house. So in the second part of the novel, when they are going to Redmond College, they are actually staying in this house, which is run by an aunt named Aunt Jimsy. So halfway through their college years, Gilbert ends up proposing to Anne, and Anne ends up rejecting Gilbert, thinking that Gilbert is not her ideal. Anne still holds many of those same ideals in her mind of what she thinks an ideal man is. And it just so happens that she meets who she thinks is her ideal man in the form of Roy Gardner. Unfortunately for Anne, because she rejects Gilbert's proposal, they end up becoming quite distant in the later half of this novel. But Anne then begins her courtship with Roy Gardner. Roy Gardner is, by all accounts, a handsome, a dark, a brooding, and a very rich man. 2 years into this courtship, Roy ends up proposing to Anne, and Anne ends up rejecting Roy. Anne rejects him because she finally realizes that Roy isn't actually her ideal. She's just obsessed with the idea that he could be her ideal, but she soon begins to feel that Roy is a very boring person and she has much more fun with Gilbert. So Anne goes home from Redmond College feeling very sad and very depressed and feel like her college experience was ruined by her courtship with Roy Gardner. Meanwhile, back in Avonlea, Diana and Fred Wright get married and Diana ends up having her first child. Anne's childhood friend Ruby Gillis ends up dying. After being down in the dumps for a while, Anne actually ends up receiving word that Gilbert Blythe is very sick with typhoid fever and could potentially die. With this news, Anne finally realizes her true feelings for Gilbert. After the terror of finding out that Gilbert may possibly die, Anne soon learns that Gilbert is going to be okay. When Gilbert recovers from his illness, they then walk to Lover's Lane and to Hester Gray's garden, where Gilbert and Anne finally become engaged and confess their feelings to one another, finally. So while I love these books, this one wasn't quite a favorite for me. I loved the little adventures that Anne goes on. In this book, she does actually end up going to Bolingbroke, the place where she was born, because her friend Phil is actually from there. So she goes to Bolingbroke and she gets to see the house that her parents lived in, where she was born, the school that her parents taught at. So that was a great aspect of the book, but much of the book is really focused on her relationship between Gilbert and her rejecting Gilbert's proposals, and then her courtship with Roy, which is so dull and boring, and then she rejects him, and like, it's kind of frustrating because you're like, Anne, Gilbert's the one for you! And it's so frustrating that she doesn't realize it till he's nearly dead. The last part of the book is like the best part of the book, because that's when she finally realizes her feelings for Gilbert and they finally get engaged and we get that big romantic ending, which was just everything that we wanted in the past 3 books. So all in all, this book was probably a 3.5 star to a 4 star. It was okay. I liked parts of it and I equally disliked parts of it. It was okay. It wasn't my favorite. Next is the 4th book in the series, Anne of Poplars. This book is presented as a series of letters that Anne writes to Gilbert while he is attending college in Halifax to become a doctor, and while Anne is teaching high school at Summerside. This book also takes place over the span of 3 years. So while Anne is in Summerside, she lives in this big house called Windy Poplars with 2 old widows and a maid called Rebecca Dew. The widows are named Aunt Chatty and Aunt Kate. So basically, while Anne is at Summerside, she navigates how to deal with the very, how do you put this, annoying Pringles. And also with her very rude and prickly colleague, Catherine Brooke. Anne also befriends a little girl who's very lonely named Elizabeth. She's also a Pringle. They live next door. So yeah, basically in this book, Anne does make quite a few trips back to Green Gables because she is so close to Avonlea. Basically at the end of the book, Anne leaves Summerside and then she and Gilbert finally are ready to get married. I'm going to start off by saying that I actually kind of hated this book. This book was so slow-paced. The format in which it was written is so annoying. After reading the last line in the previous book, that romantic ending with Anne and Gilbert finally confessing their love, you kind of expected to kind of go in this book and, you know, go in it all excited and ecstatic and expect to see more of Anne and Gilbert interacting while they're in love. But no, it's a big old book where Gilbert is possibly only talking for maybe 6 times in the entire book. It is so frustrating. You know, wily adventures with the Pringles, they're quite interesting. I liked them. Some of them obviously were awful, but some of them were quite interesting. Then you also just have the other residents around Summerside that are quite interesting. So yeah, those stories were enjoyable, but it's just the overall story. Almost every single chapter started with Anne writing a letter to Gilbert, and it was just so annoying. The only parts that I liked about this was when Anne went back to Green Gables and saw Marilla and Davy and Dora and Diana. Like, that's like the only parts of this book I really liked. This book I really had to push through to read. It was kind of a chore to read because it was kind of boring. And yeah, I did not expect that from an L.M. Montgomery book. But this is easily the worst book of the series, and I know that other people agree with me on this because it is honestly terrible. It doesn't push the plot forward at all. It's really tedious to read. It's really annoying. I honestly, there's few good things I can say about this, so for that reason, I rated it a 2-star on Goodreads. So the 5th book in the series is Anne's House of Dreams. In this book, Anne and Gilbert finally get married at Green Gables. They soon move to Four Winds Point, which is the near village to Glen St. Mary, and to what Anne calls her House of Dreams. They move there as Gilbert is taking up the medical practice of his uncle. There are many new characters in this novel, and each one of them are great. First we have Captain Jim. Captain Jim is a former sailor who is now the keeper of the lighthouse. He, Anne, and Gilbert all become fast friends and frequently visit each other. We also have Miss Cornelia Bryant, an unmarried woman in her 40s and a self-proclaimed man-hater, who I just adore. She is also very religious. Gilbert and Captain Jim all get into very deep and long conversations, and Captain Jim just loves to tease her. Then there is Leslie Moore. Leslie Moore was forced to marry at a young age after her father and brother died, and she doesn't particularly like her husband. Her husband ends up going on this year-long sea voyage, and while he's on this sea voyage, he mysteriously becomes brain damaged, and he is presumed missing during this time, but Captain Jim finds him and brings him back to the island. So therefore, Leslie is kind of forced to look after him, and she is just absolutely miserable. She sees her husband as nothing more but a burden and a hindrance on her happiness. Anne and Leslie do become friends, but Leslie does hold some bitter feelings toward Anne because she thinks that Anne has this absolutely perfect life. Marilla actually visits Anne and Gilbert in this novel quite often. She is also present when Anne gives birth to her first child, Joyce, who actually ends up dying quite shortly after birth. After little Joyce dies, Anne is very depressed. She often cannot see the happiness or the joy in life. Later on in the story, Leslie rents a room to a writer named Owen Ford. Owen finds the inspiration for his new novel based on the life of Captain Jim, which he then calls Life Book of Captain Jim. During this time, Leslie and Owen begin to have feelings toward one another, but they both know that they can do nothing about their feelings. Owen shortly thereafter leaves after he is finished writing his book. Gilbert examines Leslie's husband, who is brain damaged, Dick. Which honestly, oh my god, I hate that name for characters. But Gilbert concludes that her husband could actually be back to normal with a simple surgery, which he has to go to Montreal for. Anne and Miss Cornelia are very strongly opposed against surgery because they think that once Dick comes back to normal, he will just be even worse for Leslie than he already is now. Anne and Gilbert get into quite a huge fight over this, but in the end, Gilbert tells Leslie her findings, and Leslie ends up agreeing to the surgery. When Dick awakens from surgery, it is actually revealed that he is not Dick at all, but he's Dick's cousin, George, who apparently in their youth has always looked very similar. George actually accompanied Dick to Cuba, where Dick ended up dying from yellow fever. So with this news, Leslie returns home, and shortly thereafter, her and Owen Ford ends up getting married. While all this is happening, Anne gives birth to her second child. At the end of the book, old Captain Jim receives his advance copy of his life story, where he reads it and happily dies after he's done reading his life story. Miss Cornelia Brandt announces that she is engaged to be married. Anne, Gilbert, and their new baby Jen, along with their new housekeeper Susan Baker, move into the house at the Glen, which later becomes known as Ingleside. Anne is absolutely saddened to leave her house of dreams, as it's her perfect house, but she knows that she must do it so Gilbert can be closer to town to tend to sick patients. Owen Ford and Leslie Ford move into the House of Dreams, but later on in the series they mostly use it as a summer home. So this is hands down my favorite book out of the entire Anne of Green Gables series. I even like this book more than the first, if that's even possible. This book is just so good, and I honestly did not see the twist of Dick ended up being actually his cousin George. Like, that was just like mind blown. Just the story in this, I love the characters in this book so much. Captain Jim has to be one of my favorite characters I've ever read about. He is just wonderful. I'm so sad that he died, but man, I wish Ellen Montgomery would have like written Captain Jim's life book for real, because that's a book that I would read. I also loved Miss Cornelia. She is just a good old man-hater, and I loved it. She was so hilarious, and then, you know, in the end we find out that she's actually engaged to get married, which was such a surprise. There's so many surprises in this book, but it's also absolutely sad and heartbreaking when Anne and Gilbert lose their first child. That was so sad to read about. When I read it, my heart just broke. Oh my god. And then when Jim dies, my heart breaks even further. But I was so happy that when, you know, we find out that Dick isn't actually Dick and it's just his cousin. I mean, it's just, it's great, because then Leslie and Owen, they get married, and it's just so good. This was like the best book. Like, I can't find a fault with it. It was so good. One of those books that just give me a warm and cozy feeling. Like, this is one of my all-time favorite books. Like, there's nothing more to say about it. I love it. I adore it. It is so good. This is easily a 5-star read for me. So yeah, there you have it. I know this video was probably very long. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Be sure to check me out on Instagram, Goodreads, and Twitter. The links will be in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time. Bye!